For millions of Americans growing up in the 60s and 70s, Bonanza wasn't just a TV show. It was a ritual, a place of comfort. And at the center of that world was Hoss Cartwright, a man so big, so gentle, and so kind that you almost forgot he was just a character. But here's the truth most people never really talked about. Hoss may have been fiction, but the soul behind him, Dan Blocker, was as real, as decent, and as quietly heroic as any man who ever walked this earth. On screen, Hoss was the kind of man everyone wished they knew. A mountain of a man who could wrestle a grizzly but would never raise his voice at a child. He was simple in the best way possible, loyal, trusting, full of laughter. The kind of character who reminded you that strength didn't have to be loud and goodness didn't need to be dressed up. But off-screen, Dan Blocker was something else entirely. He wasn't just playing a good man, he was one. And the difference between Hoss and Dan isn't what you might think. Because while Hoss was sweet and kind, Dan was sharp. He had a mind that ran deep, and a heart that didn't just feel, but understood. Dan Blocker held a master's degree in drama. He studied literature, philosophy, and the human condition, like a man searching for something more meaningful than fame. And even when the cameras were off, he carried himself with that quiet, thoughtful grace. He once said, "The whole idea of acting, for me, is to make people feel something true." And that's exactly what he did. He gave Hoss a soul. Dan didn't need to pretend to be decent for the screen. That's just who he was. He believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. He saw acting not as celebrity, but as service. And that's why Hoss felt real, because Dan put his own values into that role. Honesty, compassion, and a fierce belief in treating people right. There's a story his castmates love to tell. Michael Landon once said that Dan Blocker was the kind of man who made you want to be better without ever saying a word. And isn't that something? In a world full of noise and ego, here was a man who led with kindness, not with volume. And while Hoss was content to stay on the ranch, Dan Blocker had dreams far beyond the frontier. He loved his family deeply, and when fame started pulling too hard at their privacy, he packed them up and moved to Switzerland, not to escape, but to protect what mattered most. That's not something a Hollywood star does. That's something a father, a real man, does. He never chased the spotlight. He chased peace, purpose, and a quieter kind of success, the kind you measure in respect, not ratings. So if you ever felt connected to Hoss, if his smile, his heart, his way of showing up for others made you feel a little less alone, it wasn't just the writing. It was Dan. It was his story, his spirit, his way of turning a role into something that healed. And behind that gentle smile was a man who had already walked through hell and come out standing. Because before Hollywood, before the ranch, before Bonanza, Dan Blocker was a soldier, a real one. And the things he saw and did in Korea would shape every quiet act of courage that followed. Let's go back to that battlefield. Let's look at the moment. A gentle giant became a hero. They say some people are born to stand out, and with Dan Blocker, that wasn't just a figure of speech, it was literal. On December 10, 1928, in a tiny Texas town called DeKalb, something unforgettable happened. A baby boy came into the world weighing a staggering 14 pounds. In the middle of a struggling America, where most babies were half that size and families barely scraped by, Dan's arrival wasn't just unusual. It was almost mythic. Back then, life was tough. It was the tail end of the Roaring '20s, but in towns like DeKalb, the roar was more of a quiet hum. Folks lived simple lives, prayed for rain, and made do with what little they had. When the Great Depression hit a year later, everything got even harder. Money was tight. Futures felt fragile. So when a child came into the world with the kind of strength you could see from day one, it gave people something to talk about. Something to hope for. Dan's parents, Ora and Chuck Blocker, weren't people of means. They didn't have silver spoons or big dreams of stardom. They had calloused hands, strong backs, and a deep belief in doing right by others. They named their boy Bobby Dan Davis Blocker, and from the moment he could walk, it was clear he was going to be a big presence in a world that often tried to keep people small. As Dan grew, so did everything about him, his size, his heart, and his sense of duty. By the time he was just a boy, he was already doing a man's work. helping carry groceries in his family's store, loading grain, hauling lumber. Not because anyone told him he had to, but because where he came from, pitching in wasn't optional. It was expected. By age 10, Dan was strong enough to work side by side with grown men. By 12, he stood over 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds. He could have used that strength to push people around. But that wasn't who he was. Folks in town started calling him Biggin, but not with fear, with admiration. Because even as a child, Dan had something rare, a quiet kind of power, and a heart that knew how to handle it. People who knew him back then will tell you. He was always first to help, last to complain. He didn't speak more than he needed to, but when he did, people listened. Not because his voice was loud, but because it came from a place of truth. And that stayed with him his whole life. The world didn't hand Dan Blocker anything easy. He wasn't born into fame. He didn't have a lucky break. What he had was grit, values, and a sense of purpose that started right there in small-town Texas. That sense of purpose would carry him far. But not before life threw him into a place where every ounce of that strength and character would be tested in ways most of us can't imagine. Before Hollywood. Before Bonanza. Before the laughter, the fame, and the cowboy hats, Dan Blocker was just a young man in uniform, sent halfway across the world into one of the bloodiest conflicts of his generation. And that's where we go next, into the cold, brutal hills of Korea, where the gentle giant would become something even more powerful, a hero. Before Dan Blocker became Hoss Cartwright, and before his name was known across America, he was just Biggin to the folks in O'Donnell, Texas. A nickname born not from fear, but from affection. Because in that small town, where everyone knew your name and your story, Dan stood out, not just in size, but in spirit. He was a boy who worked like a man. From the time he could lift a sack of grain, he was helping his family run their local grocery store. You didn't have to tell Dan twice. If a customer needed help carrying something, he'd already be there, hauling bags with arms like tree trunks and a smile just as wide. That store was more than a business. It was the heart of the town. And Dan? He was part of what made it beat. The people who remember him from those days don't just talk about how big he was, they talk about how good he was. There's a story that still gets passed around town. One winter, a widow named Mrs. Eldridge came in, struggling to carry her coal sack home. Dan, barely a teenager, offered to walk it all the way to her porch and then split the wood in her yard for free. No fuss, no favor asked. Just the kind of thing he did like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. People remembered, and that's the thing with Dan Blocker. He didn't have to say much. His actions spoke loud enough. Whether it was helping a neighbor fix a fence or showing up at the church potluck with his sleeves rolled up, ready to serve, Dan was dependable in a world that often wasn't. It's no wonder that by the time he hit his teens, folks around town were already saying, that boy's gonna be something special. He was 6 feet tall by age 12, 200 pounds of muscle and manners. Some kids his size might have thrown that weight around, tried to make others feel small. Not Dan. If anything, he used his size to protect the underdog. One man recalled seeing young Dan step in during a schoolyard scuffle. Not to fight, but to stop one. He didn't yell or swing, the man said. He just stood there, calm as ever, and that was enough. But Dan's strength didn't just come from his body. It came from those Texas values carved into him from the inside out. Faith, work, fairness, respect. The kind of things you don't learn from books. You learn them from people who live them. And Dan lived them every day. And maybe that's why, even decades later, folks from O'Donnell still light up when they talk about him. He wasn't just a celebrity who came from their town. He was their boy. He represented the best of what they believed in, and he never forgot where he came from. But even in a small town, sometimes something bigger calls you. And for Dan Blocker, that call didn't come from Hollywood just yet. It came from a football field, and eventually, from a college stage. Because for all his strength and loyalty, there was something inside Dan most people didn't see at first. A love for stories, a spark of creativity, and a hunger to express something deeper than words. And all of that started with a single favor backstage, one that would change the entire course of his life. Dan Blocker wasn't the kind of man who chased the spotlight. In fact, for most of his early life, the idea of being on a stage was about as far from his mind as anything could be. He was a Texas boy, strong, quiet, raised to believe in hard work and steady hands. His plan was simple. Go to college, get a degree in English, maybe teach, maybe coach, and live a good, honest life. But like it does for so many of us, life had something different in store. It started with a favor. Dan was a student at Sul Ross State University, playing football on a scholarship, already known around campus for his size and strength. One day, the theater department needed help moving some heavy props for a play. Dan didn't think twice. He stepped in to lend a hand, the same way he always had back home in O'Donnell. But something happened backstage that day. As he stood in the wings, watching the actors rehearse, listening to the rhythm of their voices and the stillness of the room, a part of him woke up. Something he didn't even know he'd been missing. The director noticed him, how he carried himself, how naturally he fit into the energy of the space, and offered him a tiny role. Just a line or two. Nothing big. Dan could have laughed it off, said no. But instead, he said yes. And when he walked out onto that stage for the first time, something shifted. He didn't just act. He felt. And for the first time, Dan Blocker, the boy built for the football field, realized he had another kind of strength inside him. The kind that could reach people, that could move them. That night, he didn't talk much. He went home, sat with it, thought about what it meant, thought about the life he was building, and whether this unexpected detour was something he could trust. Because this wasn't just a change of major, it was a change of identity. In a place and time when most men were expected to pick a trade and stick to it, stepping into the arts took guts. It meant walking away from a safe path and into the unknown. And for someone like Dan, who had always carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, that wasn't an easy decision. But he made it. He switched from English to theater, gave up his plan to become a teacher. And he didn't do it for fame or glory. He did it because something about that stage felt like home. Because he saw the power of storytelling. Because, deep down, he knew that lifting people up didn't always mean carrying their burdens. It could also mean helping them feel something real. He started doing more plays, digging deep into characters, learning how to use his voice, his presence, his heart. And slowly, a new future began to take shape. One that didn't look anything like the one he'd imagined, but felt more right with every step. His professors were surprised. His friends were curious. But Dan? He was focused. Quietly, steadily, he was building a new kind of life. Eventually, that path led him to New York City. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy. He worked odd jobs, took every opportunity he could find, and never let go of that same work ethic that had carried him through grain fields and football games. The boy from a small Texas town was now walking city streets, chasing down auditions, and chasing something bigger than fame, something honest. But before his acting dreams could fully take root, the world came calling in another way. War was on the horizon. And like so many young men of his generation, Dan didn't run from it. He stepped up. Because deep down, before he was ever an actor, he was a soldier. And what happened next would shape not just his career, but the man he would become. Dan Blocker had already lived a big life before Hollywood ever knew his name. But if you really want to understand the kind of man he was, you have to look at what happened when the cameras weren't rolling. When the world was at war and Dan wasn't reading scripts, he was reading maps and watching the skies for enemy fire. At just 22 years old, he found himself a long way from Texas, wearing army green, standing on frozen ground in Korea, with nothing but instinct and courage to guide him. He didn't sign up to be a hero. Like most young men at the time, he answered the call. Because that's what you did. You served. You stood up. You put your body on the line for people you'd never meet and places you couldn't pronounce. And Dan? He didn't complain. He just did his job. Quietly. Steadily. With the same sense of duty he'd carried since he was a boy, helping neighbors fix fences back in O'Donnell. Stationed with the 179th Infantry Regiment, Dan was sent to the front lines, right into the thick of it, Pork Chop Hill. A name that meant nothing to most Americans at the time, but everything to the men who fought there. It was brutal, cold, relentless, nights with no sleep. Days where the only thing louder than the gunfire was the sound of your own heartbeat. And then came the moment that would follow Dan for the rest of his life, not in medals, but in memory. One of his fellow soldiers was hit, pinned down under enemy fire and couldn't move. The kind of moment that tests who you really are. Dan didn't think twice. He ran toward the danger, not away from it. He reached his comrade, dragged him to safety, and took a wound himself in the process. He got a Purple Heart for that, But if you'd asked him about it later, he'd probably have just shrugged and said, "That's what anyone would have done." But we all know better. Not everyone does what's right when it's hardest. Dan did. He didn't talk much about the war after he came home. Men like him usually don't. But those who knew him said it changed him. Not in a bitter way, but in a deeper way. He'd seen what real fear looked like, what real loss looked like, and it gave him a perspective that most people never get. He didn't romanticize war. He didn't call it glorious. He called it what it was: hard, painful, and something he hoped his sons would never have to see. That's why, in the years that followed, Dan spoke out, carefully but clearly, against the way America was using its power overseas. He couldn't stay silent while other young men went through the same hell he had. He especially condemned the use of napalm. He'd seen it with his own eyes, what it did to bodies, to villages, to the soul of a nation, and he never forgot it. That wasn't politics for Dan, that was humanity. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about his service wasn't just the bravery, it was what he carried home. He brought back something so many men lose in war: his compassion, his softness. That same kindness he'd shown as a boy in Texas was still there, even after Korea. And when he finally returned, scarred but not broken, he looked for a way to live differently, to give his life to something that could heal, not harm. He didn't come back wanting parades or attention. He came back wanting peace. And slowly, quietly, he turned toward something unexpected. Something that had once been just a spark backstage at a college play, a dream that now felt more meaningful than ever. He wanted to act, to tell stories that mattered. Stories that could make people feel and think, and maybe even hope. And so, Dan Blocher, the soldier with the broken-in boots and the quiet eyes, traded his uniform for something new. He wasn't sure where it would lead. But he knew this. After everything he'd seen, if he was going to spend the rest of his life doing anything, it had to be something that brought light into the world. Next, we followed Dan as he steps into that light and into Hollywood, where against all odds, a man who hated the spotlight would become one of television's most beloved stars. Dan Blocher came back from Korea a different man, not broken, not bitter, just changed in a way only those who've seen war up close can truly understand. He was still the same gentle soul who helped neighbors and opened doors with a smile, but behind his steady eyes was a new depth, a kind of quiet knowing that never really left him. He didn't talk much about what he saw overseas. Most men who've lived through that kind of fear and loss don't. But you could feel it in him. In the way he paused before he spoke. In the things he chose not to say. Dan didn't carry that experience like a badge. He carried it like a weight. Not heavy with pride, but with responsibility. Because once you've seen what bullets really do, what napalm really smells like, what it means to lose a friend and still have to move forward, you stop looking at war the way they show it in movies. You stop calling it noble and start calling it what it is: devastating. And that's why, even as his fame grew, Dan never turned away from what he believed. He didn't seek out headlines, but when he spoke, it mattered. In a 1967 interview, he said, "I've seen what napalm does. It's not something you forget. It's not something we should be proud of." That wasn't just an opinion. That was a man remembering the cries of soldiers he couldn't save, the smell of burning earth, the cold weight of a weapon in his hands, when all he really wanted was to get back home. He spoke gently, always, never out to shock or offend, just honest. In another interview, he said, "We send boys off to fight the wars we don't have the courage to fix with our mouths, and then we wonder why they come back different." That hit hard for a lot of people, because it was true, and because it came from someone who had worn the uniform, who had earned the right to speak, not from a soapbox, but from the mud and blood of the battlefield. Dan hated bullies. He said so himself. "I hate a bully worse than anything," he once told a reporter. And war, most of the time, that's all it is. A big bully backed by a flag. It wasn't about disrespecting the troops, it was about protecting them, about making sure their sacrifice wasn't thrown around like something cheap. And maybe that's why his characters always felt so real, so human. Because when he played Hoss Cartwright, you saw a man who could lift a wagon off a trapped friend, but would rather talk things through first. A man who didn't solve problems with fists unless he had no choice. That wasn't just good writing. That was Dan. That was what he believed strength really looked like. In a time when speaking out was risky, Dan didn't stay silent. He didn't shout either. He just told the truth, in that calm, steady voice of his. The same way he always had, because for him, peace wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, and courage wasn't noise. It was doing what's right, even when no one claps for it. Coming back from war didn't make Dan Blocker famous, but it made him someone worth listening to. It gave him something deeper to stand on when the cameras started rolling. And when Hollywood finally came calling, it wasn't just his size or his smile that set him apart. It was the weight he carried behind his words, the life he'd lived before anyone ever knew his name. And that's where we go next, into the lights, the scripts, and the slow rise of a man who never wanted fame, but who became a star anyway. Because when Dan Blocker stepped into Hollywood, he wasn't trying to become a legend. He was just trying to do something good with the time he had left. Dan Blocker didn't come to Hollywood looking for stardom. He came looking for work. Honest work that could support his wife and 4 kids. Work that let him keep telling stories the way he'd learned to love back in college theater halls and off-Broadway stages. But when he got there, he realized something fast. Hollywood didn't care much for Shakespeare. It cared about cowboys. The late 1950s were the golden age of westerns, and television sets across America were tuned in to dusty towns, showdowns at high noon, and men who said more with a stare than with a speech. Dan was a classically trained actor with a heart full of nuance, but the roles being handed out were for gunslingers and ranch hands. Still, he didn't turn up his nose at it. He strapped on the boots, tipped his hat, and stepped onto the set, with the same quiet pride he'd shown in the trenches of Korea and on the fields of Texas. At first, the roles were small, maybe a line or two, maybe a passing scene. He popped up in shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and Have Gun, Will Travel. Sometimes he was the good guy, sometimes the hired muscle. But no matter the part, Dan showed up early, did the work, and treated everyone on set with the same respect, whether they were directing the scene or sweeping the floor. And people noticed. He had something that couldn't be taught. Yes, his size made him stand out, but it was the gentleness behind it that made people remember him. He could tower over a room and still make you feel safe. He could walk into a saloon scene with a shotgun over his shoulder and somehow still feel like the kind of man you'd want at your dinner table. He once said in an interview that moving from stage to television felt like leaving poetry for punchlines. But he didn't say it with bitterness, just honesty. Because while the theater gave him depth, it was TV that gave him a chance to reach into homes across America. And in his heart, Dan believed that even a small role could mean something if you filled it with truth. There's a story from those early years that speaks volumes. On the set of Colt .45, a nervous young actor forgot his lines and held up production. The director was furious. People rolled their eyes. But Dan? He walked over, clapped the kid on the back, and said, "Hey, we've all been there. Let's try it again together." That was Dan. He didn't just act like a good man on screen. He was one when the cameras stopped rolling. As time went on, he started getting noticed, not just for his size or presence, but for his timing, his warmth, his ability to bring heart to even the roughest characters. That led to a recurring role as Tiny Boudinger in Cimarron City, a part that let Dan show more of who he was. Funny, grounded, and deeply human. It wasn't a breakout moment, but it opened a door. And right behind that door was the opportunity that would change everything. He didn't chase it, he didn't push for it. But the producers of a new series called Bonanza saw what others were just starting to see, that Dan Blocker was something special. And that special something was exactly what they needed. Next, we head to the Ponderosa Ranch, where Dan Blocker became Hoss Cartwright, and where a gentle giant from Texas finally found the role that fit him like a second skin. Dan Blocker never set out to be a star. He wasn't drawn to fame or the flashing lights of Hollywood. He just wanted to provide for his family, to work with integrity, and to tell stories that mattered. But when he stepped into the role of Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, something extraordinary happened, something that neither he nor the network saw coming. America fell in love with him. When Bonanza first aired in 1959, it was just another Western in a sea of shoot-'em-ups. But it didn't take long for the show to stand out. What made it different wasn't just the sweeping landscapes or the father-son dynamics. It was the heart. And Hoss Cartwright, played by Dan Blocker, was that heart. Hoss was big, bigger than life. But his strength didn't come from his size, it came from his soul. He was honest, loyal, kind to the core. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't perfect, but he made people feel safe, seen. And in a time when the world was changing fast, and families were clinging to any sense of stability they could find, Hoss became more than just a TV character. He became a comfort, a friend. For some folks, even a father figure. And that's because Dan didn't play Hoss, he was Hoss. The gentleness, the humor, the old-fashioned decency, it wasn't an act. It was who Dan had always been. The same kid from O'Donnell, Texas, who helped his neighbors with chores and never needed to be the loudest man in the room to make an impact. That part of him just shone through every frame. Within just a few seasons, Bonanza became one of the highest-rated shows on television. Families gathered around their sets every Sunday night, dinner plates on laps, waiting to see what the Cartwrights would do next. And while the show had action and drama, it was the quiet moments, the looks, the laughs, the lessons, that kept people coming back. And no one delivered those better than Hoss. Viewers wrote thousands of letters, some just to say thank you. Children sent crayon drawings of the Ponderosa. Veterans said Hoss reminded them of the guys they served with. Tough on the outside, gentle underneath. And parents said they trusted him, even admired him. Because Hoss always tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Dan didn't win Emmys for his role. He didn't need to, he won people. People who saw themselves in him. People who wished the world had more folks like him. His co-stars, Lorne Greene, Michael Landon, they didn't just act with him, they loved him. Michael once said, Dan had a way of making the set feel like a home, like we weren't just actors, we were brothers. And while the fame could have changed him, it didn't. Dan stayed grounded. He still laughed with the crew, still talked about his kids, still treated the janitor the same way he treated the producer. He once said, "If fame ever makes me forget who I am, I hope someone shakes me." But no one ever had to. Dan never lost sight of what mattered. That's what made him rare. In an industry built on make-believe, Dan Blocker was real. And through Hoss, he gave America a kind of hope. Hope that strength could be gentle, that good men still existed, and that the best heroes weren't always the ones with the fastest draw. But even as the spotlight grew brighter, Dan felt something pulling at him. A longing for quiet. For space. For a life that wasn't always watched, always scheduled, always scripted. And that's when he made a decision that shocked Hollywood, but made perfect sense to the people who really knew him. Next, we'll follow Dan as he steps away from the stage and into the stillness of Switzerland, searching not for a role, but for a life that felt more like his own. Dan Blocker had the kind of fame most actors dream about, but he never dreamed of it. He didn't crave attention. He didn't light up at the sound of applause. What mattered to Dan was simple: being a good husband, a steady father, and a man who could look himself in the mirror without feeling like he'd lost who he was. And as the years passed and the success of Bonanza soared, Dan began to feel something tugging at him. A quiet voice that kept saying, "This isn't who I want to be forever." You see, fame doesn't always show up like a thunderstorm. Sometimes it creeps in, slow, steady, until one day you realize you can't walk down the street without being called by a name that isn't yours. For Dan, that name was Hoss. He loved the role, respected it. But after a while, it stopped being just a job and started becoming his whole identity. People didn't see him anymore. They saw a character. And that character followed him everywhere. Even vacations became complicated. On a trip to Mexico with his family, they barely made it through the airport before he was surrounded. It wasn't hostility, it was affection. But even too much love can feel like a cage when you're trying to be a father first, and a public figure second. And Dan was always a father first. He wanted his kids to grow up with something he feared was slipping away: privacy, normalcy. The ability to ride a bike through the neighborhood or go to school without whispers and pointing fingers. So in a move that shocked many in Hollywood, Dan decided to walk away from the spotlight. Not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he knew when it was time to protect the parts of life that really mattered. He moved his entire family to Switzerland. He'd read about the beauty of the Swiss Lake Country in National Geographic, and something about it spoke to him. A place where the mountains stood quiet, the pace of life was slow, and nobody cared what show you were on. That was the kind of life he wanted to give his wife and children. And so they packed up, left behind the buzz of Los Angeles, and started over near Lake Lugano. It didn't take long for his kids to fall in love with it. They enrolled in international schools, made friends from all over the world, and began to thrive in ways Dan hadn't even dared to hope for. His wife, Dolphia, said later that moving to Switzerland wasn't an escape. It was a return to family dinners without interruption, walks in the hills without crowds, a return to the man Dan had always been before the cameras rolled. There were rumors, of course. People said he was broke, said the show was ending. Dan shut it all down. "Bonanza took good care of us," he told one reporter. "This isn't about money, it's about peace." That's who he was. A man who knew when enough was enough. A man who understood that sometimes the most successful thing you can do is stop chasing more and start holding on to what you already have. Switzerland gave Dan what Hollywood couldn't: silence when he wanted it, and space to just be himself. And though Bonanza aired there too, dubbed in German, most folks didn't recognize him on the street. For the first time in years, he could blend in. He could live like a neighbor, not a celebrity. And that small, quiet life, the one he'd earned through years of hard work and sacrifice, meant more to him than any trophy ever could. But just when life seemed to settle, just when Dan had finally carved out the kind of peace he'd been looking for, the unexpected happened. A routine surgery. A tragic complication. And in the blink of an eye, the world lost a man whose heart had always been far bigger than the roles he played. After Dan Blocker passed in 1972, something strange started making the rounds. A rumor, quiet at first, then louder, saying that he was so big, so massive that they had to bury him in a piano box. That's the kind of story people want to believe when they lose someone like Dan, not because it's true, it wasn't. He was laid to rust in a standard casket at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, but the legend stuck around anyway. Because it said something real, even if the details weren't. Dan Blocker wasn't just large in size. He was large in heart, in presence, in the way he made people feel. When a man like that dies, people reach for something mythic, something that matches the hole he leaves behind. And so, the piano box became a symbol. Not of fact, but of feeling. A way to say he was bigger than life. And the truth is, he was. But Dan's legacy wasn't just built on warmth or fame. It was built on the way he stood up, especially when it counted. There was a moment during the Bonanza years that still echoes today. The cast and crew were on a trip in the South, back when segregation still held its grip in certain places. They arrived at a hotel after a long day, only to be told that their black crew members weren't welcome, that they'd have to find somewhere else to sleep. Dan didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He just looked the man behind the desk in the eye and said, "Then none of us are staying," and he walked out. Just like that. Everyone followed. No press conference, no protest signs. Just a man doing the right thing without needing credit for it. That's the kind of story you don't forget, especially if you were the one being told you didn't belong. One of the black crew members said years later, "Dan didn't just stand with us. He stood for us. And he didn't do it to be seen. He did it because that's who he was." Michael Landon said the same. That Dan's moral compass never wavered. That he never waited for someone else to lead. When it came to fairness, Dan didn't need a script. He already knew his lines by heart. But if you really want to see Dan Blocker's spirit come to life, you don't have to look at the headlines. Just watch him eat. Dan loved food the way some people love music or baseball, with real, honest joy. His breakfasts were legendary. 12 eggs, 2 loaves of bread, and a jug of milk just to start the day. Lunch and dinner? Bring on the roast, potatoes, ham, pie. He wasn't picky, just passionate. On the Bonanza set, the crew used to laugh watching him clear a plate that could have fed 3 men. But it wasn't gluttony, it was celebration. A man who had once marched through freezing Korean trenches was now eating well, living well, and grateful for every bite. He had a sweet tooth too. Couldn't resist cookies or pie. And he didn't try to. That made him more relatable than ever. Co-stars would tease him, saying craft services had to restock every time Dan came through. But they did it with love. Because there was something comforting about seeing a man that big enjoy something so simple, so purely. It made him real. He even invested in the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, a nod to the ranch that made him famous. And let's be honest, it didn't hurt that he could walk in anytime and eat for free. But even as he joked about it, there was something underneath that stuck. Dan believed in comfort, in connection, and sometimes that came in the form of a hot plate and good company. For Dan Blocker, food wasn't just fuel, it was family. It was memory. It was a moment to slow down and enjoy what you have while you have it. And that same energy of presence, of gratitude, was what he brought to every role, every set, every handshake with a fan. He made the ordinary feel like something special. Because to Dan, it was. And that's why even now, decades later, we still tell stories about him. Some of them true, some of them slightly stretched, but all of them filled with love. Because when a man lives the way Dan Blocker lived, with heart, humility, and quiet courage, he doesn't just play a role on TV. He leaves a mark on people, a lasting one. Dan Blocker wasn't supposed to go that soon. At 43 years old, he was still full of life, full of stories left to tell, full of meals to share and laughs to give. When he went into the hospital in May of 1972 for what doctors called a routine gallbladder surgery, no one thought twice. He was strong, a gentle giant, and surgery was just one of those things you got through. But something went wrong. A pulmonary embolism, a sudden blood clot, stopped his heart, and just like that, he was gone. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. The world didn't take the news lightly. Newspapers ran headlines that felt more like eulogies. Talk shows paused for a moment of respect. But it was in the quiet spaces where the loss hit hardest. In living rooms where Bonanza reruns suddenly felt different. In homes where kids cried because Hoss was more than a character. He was family. Lorne Greene called it the most painful loss of his career. Michael Landon, who had stood beside Dan for years on set and off, said the grief was so heavy it followed him home and stayed. Dan's wife, Dolphia, was shattered. They'd built a life together long before the cameras ever showed up. Now she had to figure out how to carry that life forward without him. Their son, Dirk, was just 19, old enough to know what death meant, too young to be ready for it. "We never got to say goodbye," he said later. He was just gone. On the set of Bonanza, the loss was more than emotional. It was foundational. Dan wasn't just one of the stars. He was the heart, the glue that held the Cartwright family together on screen and the crew together behind the scenes. And everyone knew, without Hoss, there was no Bonanza. NBC tried to carry on. They debated whether to recast the role or write Hoss off gently. But in the end, they made the most honest choice. They didn't replace him. They didn't explain it away. They let the silence speak for itself. The first episode after Dan's passing didn't say where Hoss had gone. He was just not there. And that absence said everything. Michael Landon wrote that episode. He poured his grief into the pages, creating a space for the audience to feel what they were feeling without forcing it into dialogue. The characters didn't cry on cue, they just looked across the dinner table and felt the emptiness. And viewers across America cried with them. The ratings started to drop. The magic faded. NBC moved the show to a new time slot, but it didn't help. The show had been many things: adventurous, funny, heartfelt. But what kept people coming back was its soul. And that soul was gone. In 1973, Bonanza ended. Not with a bang. Not with a grand finale. But with the quiet understanding that some stories can't go on when the heart behind them stops beating. Dan didn't leave behind mansions or scandals or flashy headlines. He left behind something stronger. An example. A set of principles. Be kind, show up, mean what you say. Those were the lessons Dirk carried with him. And even now, decades later, you can hear echoes of Dan, in the way Dirk speaks, in the way he laughs, in the way he treats people on set. He once said that the hardest part wasn't just losing his dad. It was not getting the chance to ask him all the questions he hadn't yet thought to ask. But somehow, the answers still came. In memories. In mannerisms. In the deep knowledge that love, when it's real, doesn't vanish when a person does. Dan Blocker was more than an actor. He was a father, a husband, a friend, a quiet protector of decency. And the mark he left wasn't just on a television screen. It was in the lives he touched, the example he set, and the kind of man he taught his son to become. Maybe the real measure of a man isn't found in the applause or the headlines, but in the way people remember him after he's gone. Dan Blocker didn't chase fame. He didn't need to. Because the way he lived, steady, kind, and true, spoke louder than any spotlight ever could. And even now, all these years later, people still feel him. In the way they talk about Bonanza, in the way they smile when they hear the name Hoss, and in the way they pause, just for a second, when they remember what it felt like to watch someone who seemed to carry the best parts of all of us. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a tear, hold on to that. Because stories like this don't come around often. They remind us that strength can be gentle, that kindness never goes out of style, that doing the right thing, even when no one's watching, is still what matters most. If Dan's story made you think of someone you miss, or someone you want to be more like, I hope you'll take a moment to let it sink in. And if you believe the world still needs stories like this, stories that lift people up, that shine a light on decency, that make us feel something real, then help us keep telling them. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Not just for us, but for the community we're building here, a place where real stories matter. Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for remembering a man who lived quietly, loved deeply, and left behind something no camera could ever fully capture. May we all carry a little bit of Dan Blocker with us, in the way we walk, the way we speak, and the way we choose, every day, to treat the people around us with heart.